Ruth chapter 2. Now there was a relative of Naomi's deceased husband Elimelech, who was a prominent rich man called Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
"Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favour."
"Go, my daughter."
So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers,
"The Lord be with you."
The Lord bless you.
Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers,
"To whom does this young woman belong?"
"She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She asked if she could glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment."
Then Boaz said to Ruth,
"Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn."
Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him,
"Why have I found favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?"
"All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land, and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for what you've done. May you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge."
"May I continue to find favour in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to me, even though I am not one of your servants."
At mealtime, Boaz said to her,
"Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine."
So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men,
"Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her."
So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over, after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her,
"Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you."
So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said,
"The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz."
"Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin."
He even said to me, "Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest."
"It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise you might be bothered in another field."
So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. She lived with her mother-in-law. When my daughter first went to Bristol University, she was lodged in Colston Hall. It was named after Edward Colston, like many other places in Bristol. You may well recall the name because it was his statue that was pulled down during the recent Black Lives Matter protests and thrown into Bristol Harbour. Until a few years ago, Edward Colston was known as an industrialist and philanthropist, but more recently, people know him as a slave trader, which is why his statue was pulled down. Today, in our reading from Ruth chapter 2, we meet another rich, powerful man, Boaz. How would he be known? Perhaps as a man of God. The first words we hear from him when he greets his workers coming to the fields in the morning are, "The Lord be with you," to which they reply, "The Lord bless you." He seems like a man of God. And then later in the story, when he praises Ruth for the way that she has stuck by Naomi, he asks that the Lord will bless her for her kindness and loyalty. Boaz, man of God. And perhaps he can also be known as a philanthropist. He sees a poor, vulnerable, young foreign woman working in his fields, and he protects her. He ensures that she won't be molested, and he makes sure that she goes home with plenty of grain for herself and her mother. A kind act, the act of a philanthropist. But there is another way you could see the story. A powerful man sees a vulnerable young girl working in his fields and quickly ensures that she is in his debt, makes it clear to her that if she leaves his protection, she will be in danger. And sure enough, before too long, she is in his debt and then in his bed. The power imbalance is as great as that between Harvey Weinstein and some poor Hollywood actress trying to make her way in the world of film. So would Boaz's statue be pulled down by people with modern sensibilities and thrown in the River Jordan? Well, I hope I haven't spoiled the story for you. I know it can be read as a romance, rather like Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice, but it's important also to remember that this is a story from a patriarchal society, one in which men really did have all the power, and women like Ruth and Naomi had very few choices open to them if they were to survive. It's all too easy to read Bible stories and think that because this is God's people living in the promised land and with the laws that Moses received on Mount Sinai to guide them, that it must be a good society, a godly society. And if things go wrong, that's just the result of a few people's sinfulness. But actually, that's not the picture we really get in the Bible. The book of Ruth comes from the time of the Judges. And if you read the book of Judges, it's horrific. It's full of the most awful violence and barbarous behavior. And then after the time of the Judges comes the time of the kings. Surely that was a golden age, wasn't it? Kings ruling under God, the basis of the idea of the divine right of kings that has been part of our own country's history. Well, no, because if you read the first book of Samuel carefully, you find that God never wanted his people to have kings. It records that God rather grudgingly agreed to the people's request to have a king to make them like the other nations. And it really didn't end happily. Ruth's great-grandson, David, was the second of these kings. And apart from being the writer of beautiful psalms, he was also someone who had Uriah the Hittite murdered so that he could have his wife Bathsheba for his own. Not really a very nice man. And if you look at all the kings, then very few were righteous. Some were, like Hezekiah, but most of them were corrupt, idolatrous, and eventually the kingdom disintegrated, split in two, and then lost to foreign powers so that all the people went into exile. When we read the Bible, we shouldn't think that just because they had a man, a king, ruling over them, that means that that's how society should be, that's how God wants it to be. No, what we see in the Bible are acts of kindness, acts of godliness done in the midst of corruption and huge problems in society. That's why the prophets so often had to rail in God's name against corruption, against people who did not look after the widow and the orphan. We don't have to accept that the system that Ruth and Boaz lived in was a good one in order to see that there were good and godly things going on. Today, we're being forced to confront problems in our own society with the Black Lives Matter protests, as well as other protests about our responsibilities for climate change and what we're doing to the planet. But in the midst of this, there are also beacons of light, beacons of hope and kindness and community spirit, community initiatives that make a real difference. Back to the story of Ruth, and we see that there are some safety nets for those who are vulnerable. And Ruth is able to exploit some of those. She gleans. Now, gleaning was a tradition that has passed down into many, many societies. Until the industrial age, it was very much part of British society that leftover grain, when the harvest came, was left for the poor to pick up. And the harvesters were not to go back and absolutely clear the fields of every last grain. They were to leave some for the poor and vulnerable as an act of charity and goodness. And this was actually written into the law in the book of Deuteronomy, and so it was part of Israelite society. Let me read you some verses from Deuteronomy. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. When you harvest your grain and forget a sheaf back in the field, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, so that God, your God, will bless you in your work. When you shake the olives off your trees, don't go back over the branches and strip them bare. What's left is for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. And when you cut the grapes in your vineyard, don't take every last grape. Leave a few for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. Don't ever forget that you were a slave in Egypt, I command you. Do what I am telling you. And that's not the only passage in the books of the law, Deuteronomy in particular, that shows compassion for the poor. Now, gleaning may seem like a small thing, but actually amid the xenophobia and even occasional genocidal tendencies that we see in some parts of the Old Testament, there is this golden thread of safety net laws to protect the vulnerable. The prophets, as I've said, condemned and pronounced God's judgment on corrupt societies, and a big part of their plaint was often that the widow and the orphan, those emblems of the most vulnerable, had been neglected. Ruth, a poor immigrant, a widow with few economic options, uses the safety net of the gleaning law in order to provide food for herself and for Naomi. Boaz notices this and arranges for her to be protected and to have prize pickings from the gleaning. In a close-knit society, it's not surprising that he is able to find out who she is and to recognize his kinship with her through Naomi. We can certainly see his actions as kind and thoughtful, though we could ask, what about the other women that he doesn't protect? It's clear in the story that violence against vulnerable women was a common occurrence, otherwise Boaz would not have needed to warn his men off molesting Ruth. The implication is clear, that then as now, women were molested, raped, made to live in fear. Could Boaz have done more to protect others? Well, as an English teacher, I often used to warn my pupils against making assumptions beyond the text. We don't know any more about Boaz than we read in the book of Ruth, any more than we know how many children Lady Macbeth had or what happened to Pip and Estella after the end of Great Expectations. What we do know is that the society of the time was flawed, as ours is, and people would do what they had to survive, and that acts of kindness and safety net laws did count for something. Our National Health Service, with free access to healthcare for all, is a safety net. So are food banks, and so are the impulses that drive people to care for their neighbours. Some safety nets are official, written into the law, government approved, and some are local initiatives. As was made clear in Jelane's presentation to Deanery Synod this week, Judith inspired us to set up Pop-Up Cafe at St Michael's to provide a safety net for children and carers, a space and food and a welcome. Our monthly community lunch similarly provides a nutritious roast meal for those who might not be able to afford or prepare one. These things don't reach every child, every carer, every isolated elderly person on the estate, but what they do is very real and precious. Equally, in a society with systemic problems, what Boaz did was limited in reach, but was important, more important than either he or Ruth could ever have imagined in terms of the impact of their descendants from King David onwards on world history. At the end of chapter 2, Ruth and Naomi have hope. Ruth, who may have seemed like a powerless, vulnerable refugee, has shown initiative, intelligence, and a willingness to work for her and her family's survival, as many refugees and immigrants do to this day. She lives in a far from perfect society, and many other refugees must have fared worse than her. The Bible is not a record of a godly society with most people thriving under God's laws and just rulers and a few stragglers needing help. It's a record of a fallen world in which reform and the fight against corruption is always needed, but in which the love of God is also always at work for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. There's been a lot of talk about what lessons we can learn from lockdown and how we can go forward. Can we do better in protecting against climate change? How can we ensure that the NHS is always equipped to meet the needs of all? What role will government and local councils have in caring for the poorest, and what role will churches and other community groups have? At St. Michael's we face an uncertain future. We will flourish, I'm sure, but in exactly what form I don't know. But our link with Mascot seems even more important going forward, providing a safety net for the most vulnerable, building community, while the work of campaigning for wider reforms in society until such safety nets are not needed goes on. We need both. Some are better at campaigning for reform at a national, institutional level than others, but all of us can seek out what the Holy Spirit of compassion is doing around us and join in. I want to finish with some words from a woman who was a great reformer at a national level, a great mover and shaker among the powerful of her day, but who was also always aware of the need for acts of love and kindness within local communities. She was Teresa of Avila, and these are her words that resonate for me today as I wonder how we can make a difference to the lives of the vulnerable. She wrote, "Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are his eyes, yours are his body. Christ has no body on earth now, but ours."